I've always trusted numbers more than stories. A concentration is either above the safety line or it isn't. A plume of pollution either reaches the well or it stops short in the sand. That's what I kept telling myself the morning Warren Sloan called me into his office. 9th floor, glass tower, Brickell Avenue, a view of the bay so blue it almost looked painted on. He asked me to lead an investigation that would, by the end of that year, cost me almost everything I'd built. My name is Dr. Adrian Kessler. I was 35, and I'd spent 10 years building a name for myself as an independent consultant in groundwater cleanup. Not a glamorous job, just careful, patient work, coaxing poison earth back to health. I had a doctorate in chemical engineering. I knew how to track contamination as it moved underground. And I had a reputation for never writing down a conclusion I couldn't defend if someone pushed back hard. Warren ran a nonprofit called the Aquifer Protection Council. Small office, big mission. Protect South Florida's drinking water for the factories creeping closer to the Everglades every year. He wanted me to look into possible contamination near Pinecrest, a farming town outside the city where families have been drinking from the same shallow aquifer for 3 generations. Warren stood when I walked in. That was his way, always on his feet before you'd even settled into a room, hand extended a half second too early, like he'd rehearsed the timing. He was somewhere north of 50, silver at the temples in a way that looked cultivated rather than earned, and he had the particular stillness of a man who'd spent decades in rooms where he was always the most comfortable person present. "We need someone who won't flinch," he said, sinking back in his chair with the loose, unhurried confidence of someone who'd never once doubted himself. His hands stayed open on the desk, palms half turned upward, an inviting gesture, the posture of a man selling trust rather than demanding it. Someone the courts will believe. I remember feeling grateful, and I remember what that gratitude felt like in my body. A kind of loosening across my shoulders, a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. I'd spent years working for firms that treated pollution cleanup as a legal risk to manage. Just do enough to avoid a lawsuit, nothing more. Here, finally, was someone who seemed to actually care about the truth. I signed that same afternoon. I didn't bother reading the list of donors in the appendix. It never crossed my mind that I should. The suspected source was a chemical plant on the edge of Pinecrest, owned by Broward Industrial Holdings, part of the much bigger Broward Development Group, a name I mostly knew from billboard for luxury condos downtown. The plant made solvents for farm equipment maintenance, and looking at the first survey map, it sat uncomfortably close to the ground that fed half the private wells in town. I spent 6 weeks in the field before I wrote a single word of analysis. I drilled a ring of monitoring wells around the plant. I collected water samples in dark glass bottles, kept them cold, and sent them to a certified lab with careful paperwork tracking every step, because a result without that kind of documentation isn't evidence. It's just a guess with decimal points. Then I ran the numbers through a model that predicts how contamination spreads underground, and I watched a plume of chemical solvent take shape on my screen like a bruise spreading under skin. Dark near the plant, fading as it moved out, but not fading fast enough before it reached the town's wells. Then I did the part of the job I'm proudest of, isotope fingerprinting. Chemical solvents carry a kind of signature, a ratio buried in their carbon atoms, shaped by exactly how they were made. It's almost like a signature on a check. I compared that signature in the Pinecrest groundwater to the signature in the solvent drum stored at the Broward plant. They matched, closely enough that no honest scientist could call it a coincidence. I remember the night I finished that work. I was alone in my rented office above a hardware store in Homestead, ceiling fan turning slowly, and my heart was beating faster. Not from fear, just from that plain, clean thrill of watching proof line up exactly where you expected it to. People talk about love at first sight. I've never felt that, but I've felt this. A model finally matching the truth, and it isn't so different. The same lightness in the chest, the same refusal to look away from the screen. I wrote the report over 3 sleepless days, running on the feeling that I was finally doing the work I trained 10 years for. I concluded, plainly, that the Broward plant was the likely source of the contamination, unsafe levels in 4 of 6 wells I tested, and that the pollution wasn't breaking down on its own the way it should. Left alone, it wouldn't heal. It would just keep spreading. Warren read the report while I sat across from him, and I watched him read it the way I watch a model run, closely, looking for the moment something breaks. For the first time since I'd known him, his easy manner disappeared. His shoulders came up half an inch. He set the pages down slowly, squared up the edges like it mattered, and folded his hands so tightly his knuckles paled. "This is strong work, Adrian." He didn't look up right away. "Very strong. But I want to talk about the language before we release it." Something tightened in my stomach, quick, low, before I even understood why my body had reacted before my mind had caught up. I kept my voice level. That's a habit from years of presenting to hostel rooms. Whatever is happening under your ribs, keep it out of your throat. "The language is the finding," I said. "There's no way to soften it without misrepresenting the data. Nobody's asking you to misrepresent anything." He smiled, and I watched the smile carefully, the way I'd watch a suspicious reading on an instrument, because it didn't reach his eyes. It just sat there on his mouth, borrowed, like something he'd forgotten to give back. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and lowered his voice into the register men use when they want you to feel like you're being let in on something. "I just wonder if likely source needs to sound so final. Whether we call this an ongoing investigation instead of a conclusion. We have relationships in this community, Adrian, with companies, with institutions. This organization needs to survive past one press release." I didn't answer right away. I've learned that silence is often the strongest thing you can put in a room. It makes the other person feel it, and usually they say more than they meant to. Warren filled it exactly the way I expected him to. He glanced down at his own hands, turned his pen over once, twice, and mentioned, almost too casually, that Broward Development Group had supported the council for years, and that it would be helpful if the final report left more room for interpretation. "How helpful?" I said, "and to whom?" He looked up at that, and for just a second something moved behind his composure, a flicker, gone as fast as it came. "Don't make this adversarial, Adrian. We're on the same side." I left that afternoon with a headache building behind my right eye, and a suspicion I couldn't name yet, tightening somewhere under my ribs like a spring wound too far. It took me 4 days to find what I was looking for. I found it the way I find most things, carefully, without any drama, checking public tax records against a database I'd used before. The council's biggest donor, every single year, funneled through a middleman charity called the Everglades Legacy Fund, was Broward Development Group. Not once by accident. 6 years running. Nearly 40% of the whole budget. I sat with that for a long time before I did anything. I want to be honest about what I felt, because the honest version matters more than the neat one. I didn't feel triumphant, the way you might feel catching someone in a lie you already suspected. I felt something closer to grief, a slow, sinking feeling like watching something you trusted turn out to be standing on ground you should have checked first. My jaw ached from clenching it without noticing. I only felt the soreness later, in the shower, when I touched it. More than once I caught myself just standing at the window, arms crossed tight over my chest, shoulders drawn up near my ears, staring at nothing, running the same disbelief in circles. I confronted Warren 2 days later, in his office, with the door closed behind me. I didn't raise my voice. That's never worked for me. But I laid the donor filings on his desk one by one, in order, the way you'd lay out evidence in court, each page a small, deliberate motion, and I watched him come apart in pieces right in front of me. His breath caught, just barely, at the second page. A muscle moved at the corner of his jaw. His hand went for his coffee cup and then pulled back, empty, fingers curling around nothing, like he'd forgotten what his hand had reached for in the first place. "It's more complicated than it looks," he said finally, and his voice had lost its usual polish. It came out thinner, almost apologetic, though I don't think he meant it that way. "It's exactly as complicated as it looks." I kept my hands flat on the desk, steady, because I wanted him to see that they were steady. You asked me to soften a finding that points straight at your biggest donor. That's not complicated. That's a conflict of interest. You should have told me before I ever drilled a well. He exhaled through his nose, a short, controlled sound, and rubbed at his temple with 2 fingers as if he could massage his way back to the man he'd been an hour earlier. You have to understand the position I'm in, Adrian. This organization doesn't run on grant money alone. It runs on relationships. Every nonprofit in this state has some version of this problem, whether they admit it to their scientists or not. Then you should have told your scientist which version yours was. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I could hear it doing more work at that volume than it would have done shouting. You let me believe I was working for an organization with no stake in the outcome. That wasn't an oversight, Warren. That was a decision. You made it before I ever set foot in Pinecrest. I made it, he said, and for the first time something like anger flashed across his face, quick and defensive, gone almost as soon as it appeared. Because if I'd told you, you'd have walked. And then some other consultant, someone with looser standards than yours, would have written the report Broward wanted in the first place. At least this way, the science was real. The science is still real. I let that sit a moment before I went on. That's exactly the problem. You didn't hire me to protect the truth, Warren. You hired me because my name would make a compromised report look credible. You needed my rigor as a costume. He flinched, an actual, physical flinch, small but unmistakable, his shoulders drawing in as if the words had landed somewhere, just beneath his collarbone. For a moment, he didn't say anything at all. His eyes moved to the window, to the bay outside, that same manufactured blue, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped almost to nothing. What do you want me to say? I don't want you to say anything. I want you to publish the report as written. I stood because I could feel the conversation reaching the place where more words wouldn't change anything, only were the both of us down further. That's not a negotiation. That's the only version of this that ends with either of us able to live with it. He didn't answer. He looked, for a moment, like a much older man than the one who'd shaken my hand a half-second too early 4 months earlier. Spine curved forward, both hands pressed flat against his desk, as if he needed it to hold him up. His jaw worked once, like he was chewing on a reply he decided not to give. When he finally looked up at me, whatever had been performing confidence in him for 4 months was gone, and what was left looked almost startled to find itself alone in the room. I'll think about it, he said, which we both understood, in that moment, to mean no. What came next wasn't one big dramatic break. It was slower than that, a quiet unraveling, which I think is closer to how these things actually happen than any courtroom scene. Warren ended my contract within the week. The letter, written by his lawyer, cited differences in methodology and communication strategy, words designed to sound official while meaning nothing and everything at the same time. 2 firms that had talked to me about bigger contracts stopped calling back. I found out later, from a colleague who stayed loyal when it would have been easier not to, that Broward's legal team had quietly written to several firms around Miami, hinting that my methods were under review, a phrase with 0 legal weight and a huge social one. I want to try to describe what isolation does to someone who has spent his whole career believing that careful work speaks for itself, because I don't think you understand it until you've lived it. It isn't loud. It isn't one big betrayal. It's 100 small withdrawals. A lunch invitation that used to come every week and then doesn't. Your name quietly dropped from a conference panel. A silence on the phone that goes half a second too long before the other person finds a reason to hang up. I caught myself rehearsing conversations I'd never actually have, jaw tight, pacing the short length of my apartment, defending myself out loud to people who hadn't even accused me of anything, my hands curling in a fist at my sides where nobody could see them anyway. More than once, I thought about just walking away from the whole thing, filing the report in a drawer, taking whatever contract came next, letting Pinecrest water become somebody else's problem. I won't pretend it didn't tempt me. There's a real relief in giving up. I understand that now in a way I didn't before, and I don't think less of anyone who's ever felt it. I drove out to my parents' place in Pinecrest on a Friday evening in June. The kind of evening when the light over the grove turns the color of weak tea and the air smells like turned dirt and diesel from the last tractor pass of the day. My father had grown avocados on 4 acres for 31 years before his knees gave out and he leased the land to a neighbor. My mother still kept a garden along the back fence, watered. I understood now, with an uncomfortable new clarity, from that exact same aquifer I'd spent 6 months proving was poisoned. My father was on the back porch when I pulled in the same chair he'd sat in my whole life, forearms resting on his knees, watching the light change over the grove the way other men watch television. He didn't get up. He never did. He just nodded once, the way he'd greet a neighbor, and made room on the step beside him. We sat for a long while saying nothing, which had always been our way of saying a great deal. He had a habit, when he was thinking something through, of rubbing his thumb slowly along the side of his index finger, an old ache from years of grove work he'd never quite explained. He was doing that now. "You've got something sitting on you," he said eventually, not looking at me, still watching the trees. "Edo, you want to tell me, or you want to sit with a while first? Both, maybe." I found myself picking at a splinter on the porch step, a small nervous motion I hadn't noticed until it was already happening. "I did the work right, Dad. I know I did, and it still turned into something I didn't recognize." He waited. That was his gift. He never rushed to silence. I told him everything. The plant, the wells, the isotope match, Warren's careful smile, the donor filings lined up on the desk like evidence in a trial only I seemed to be attending. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked, gently, whether I regretted taking the contract. "No," I said. "What I regret is trusting an organization to hold itself to the same standard I held for my own work." He nodded slowly. The same nod he used to give over a bad citrus yield, absorbing a loss without letting it curdle into despair, a small, steady motion that had somehow always made me feel like the ground under both of us was still solid. "The land doesn't lie to you," he said after a while, turning his hands over, palms up, calloused and sun-spotted, like he was offering them as evidence of something. "People do. That's the whole difference between farming and everything else." I stayed 11 days. I didn't check my email once. Every morning before the heat came up, I walked the edge of my parents' old grove, hands shoved deep in my pockets, shoulders finally loosening a little more each day, and somewhere in that quiet, far from Brickell's glass towers, far from Warren's careful sentences, I remembered something with a strange kind of relief. The data hadn't changed. Whatever institution had failed me, whatever donor had bought a softer story, the chemical signature in that groundwater still matched the drums at Broward's plant. The plume was still spreading. That fact didn't need anyone's permission to stay true. I found my way back through 2 people, and I think they deserve to be named because courage rarely announces itself. Usually it just looks like someone quietly deciding they can't stomach something anymore. The first was Marcus Webb, a plant engineer who'd worked at Broward for 11 years. He reached out to me through an encrypted channel after a mutual contact, someone who trusted him, vouched for me. When we finally spoke by phone, his voice had the particular strain of a man who hadn't slept well in months. Flat in places, then suddenly too fast, words tumbling out before he could stop them, the way people talk when they've been holding something in for too long. "I want to be clear," he said early in the call. "I'm not doing this to be a hero. I don't feel like one. I feel sick, honestly. I felt sick for months." "Tell me why," I said. There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, could almost picture him gripping the phone too tightly. "I've got a daughter. She's at Pinecrest Elementary. 8 months ago, I started buying bottled water for the house and telling her it was because I liked the taste better. She's 7. She believed me." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he cleared his throat, embarrassed by it. "I filed reports on those spills for years. Real ones, documented, dated. They just disappeared into a drawer somewhere. Nobody acted on them. I kept filing them anyway, because I didn't know what else to do with what I knew." He sent me his old incident logs that night. The dates lined up almost exactly with the edge of the plume in my model. A match so clean it gave me the same quiet, unglamorous thrill I'd felt the night I first ran the isotope analysis. The second was Dana Ferreira, a journalist who covered environmental accountability and who, completely on her own, had already started digging into the Everglades Legacy Fund after a tip from inside Broward's finance department. She had a different energy on the phone than Marcus did. Brisk, unhurried in a different way, the calm of someone who had done this many times and trusted the process more than the outcome. "I'm not here to build you a villain," she told me in our first call. "I'm here to build something that holds up. If your data is solid, it'll do the work. If it isn't, I need to know that too before we go any further." "It's solid," I said. "Good. Then send me everything, and let's find out together whether it survives daylight." I gave her everything. The isotope analysis, the transport model, the well logs, Marcus's incident reports, the foundation filings tracing the council's compromised funding. I didn't need to embellish a single word. The numbers had never needed help. Her article ran in September, 6 months after Warren first showed his hand, 3 months after I'd walked my father's tired grove, trying to decide if the truth was still worth the cost of telling it. It didn't read like an expose built for outrage. It read, I think on purpose, like a careful accounting. The chemical match explained in plain language, the funding conflict laid out not as scandal, but as a structural failure. The incident logs presented for exactly what they were, a pattern documented for years by a man who'd had nowhere safe to bring it until now. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection opened a formal investigation within a month, using Marcus's records and my model as the basis for its own independent testing that confirmed everything I'd already found. 18 months later, Broward Industrial Holdings agreed to a settlement requiring a full cleanup, wells to pump and treat the contaminated water, years of ongoing monitoring, and funding for clean alternative water for every affected household in Pinecrest, including, though I rarely say this out loud, my parents' own well. I wasn't in the room for any of the negotiations. There was no dramatic hearing where I stood up and testified. There was no dramatic hearing at all. Just a settlement conference and a short statement from the state agency that mentioned my name exactly once in a footnote crediting the original technical work. Warren resigned from the council within weeks of the article coming out. I heard the board brought in new leadership with a much stricter conflict of interest policy. I haven't spoken to anyone there since, and I haven't tried to. I ran into Marcus once more, months later, at a diner near Homestead. He looked different, less guarded, his shoulders sitting lower, easier than they had on that first phone call. He still worked in industry, a different plant, a better one, he told me, and he'd stopped buying bottled water for his daughter. She asked me why, he said, smiling for what might have been the first time in the whole conversation. I told her the water got better. She just said okay, and went back to her cereal. Didn't need more than that. Neither did I. I still think, sometimes, about how different real vindication feels when it arrives quietly instead of loudly. It's nothing like the version I imagined during the worst of those lonely months. Some small, almost childish fantasy where I stood there triumphant while everyone who doubted me was forced into a public retraction. That's not what happened. And I've come to believe that's not usually what happens when the truth wins the slow way instead of the fast one. What happened instead was smaller, and I think it lasts longer, a confirmed model, a corrected record, and a family in Pinecrest, my own among others, no longer drinking water poisoned by someone else's carelessness. I drove out to see my father again the week the settlement was finalized. We sat on the same porch in the same weak tea light, and I told him the wells would be clean again within a decade. That cleanup, unlike vindication, follows its own slow clock, measured in monitoring visits, not headlines. He listened the way he always had, without interrupting, his thumb moving once again along the side of his finger. And when I finished, he went quiet for a long moment, looking out over the grove he didn't work anymore, but still, somehow, belonged to. "You found the source," he said. "That's the job, isn't it? Not to fix it yourself, just to find it, say so clearly and not stop saying so. I think that's the truest thing anyone said to me through the whole ordeal. I didn't save Pinecrest. I didn't bring down Broward Development Group or fix a whole industry that will produce another compromised nonprofit and another buried report before the decade's out. I found a number that wouldn't lie, and when it became inconvenient, I refused to let anyone round it down. In the end, that was the whole of what I had to offer. And that year, against everything I expected, it turned out to be enough.